feels like every time you opened the news this week, the Supreme Court was back in the headlines. You're not imagining it. I mean, just in the last few days, they ruled on mail ballots, presidential power over independent agencies, birthright citizenship, temporary protected status. They even weighed in on transgender athletes. The justices also declined to hear Donald Trump's appeal on a $5 million judgment in the Carroll case. It's been one of the busiest weeks the court has had in a long time. At first, these stories didn't seem connected, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think they're all answering the same question. Who gets the power and who gets to keep it? Welcome back to The Quiet Loud. I'm DeAntony Collins. You know, one of my favorite parts of doing this show is that I get to spend a week buried in court opinions, congressional hearings, government reports, and a lot of really good journalism out there. And then I get to come here and tell you what finally clicked for me. And this week, it was power. Not campaign power, not polling power or institutional power, but who has the power and who can check it. And what happens when those guardrails start moving. That's what all tonight's stories have in common. So let's start with one that probably will get the least attention, but may have the biggest long-term coincidences. So that's who controls the government now. So let me ask you something. When you buy a plane ticket and suddenly there's a fee, or your bank hits you with a charge you didn't expect, or two giant companies want to merge, who do you think is supposed to keep an eye on that? Most people couldn't name the agency, and honestly, that's okay. You shouldn't have to. See, those agencies are supposed to do their jobs whether you know their names or not. And this week, the Supreme Court changed who has more control over some of them. For almost 90 years, a Supreme Court case called Humphrey's Executor limited a president's ability to fire leaders of certain independent agencies simply because he disagreed with them. Well, this week, that changed. The court ruled that Trump could remove FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, overturning that old precedent and giving presidents more direct authority over at least some independent agencies. Now, here's the part I don't want to gloss over because it's important. The court didn't give Trump everything he wanted. In fact, it left Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook in her position while the case continues. That's a reminder that these rulings aren't always as simple as Trump won or Trump lost. Sometimes the court expands presidential power in one area and draws a line somewhere else, and that's exactly why you have to read past those headlines. So why should you care, you might be asking? Because this isn't really about one Fed Reserve Commissioner. It's about how much independence Congress can give agencies that regulate parts of our government. Think about it like this. Imagine your local baseball league hired referees, but one team could fire those referees whenever it didn't like the call. Even if nobody actually gets fired, the relationship changes. That's the concern some legal scholars have about this decision. Supporters of the ruling see it differently. See, they argue that if the president is elected to run the executive branch, then the people working in that branch should answer directly to the president. That's a legitimate constitutional debate, probably, and if it wasn't this president. See, we've watched him try to grab up all the power he can from each of the branches and then tell them they don't have standing to correct him. All right? So regardless of where you come down on that, this was a significant shift, though, because Donald Trump has argued for years that presidents should have greater control over the executive branch. This ruling moves that law closer to that vision. And I think that's the bigger story. Not one personnel decision, a broader change in how presidential power is understood. Because once the Supreme Court redraws that line, every future president inherits it. And that brings me to something else. Power isn't only exercised through government agencies. Sometimes it's exercised through the rules that determine whose vote gets counted. And that's next. So I'll ask you another thing. If you filled out your ballot correctly, follow every single rule and put it in the mail before Election Day, should your vote stop counting because the Postal Service took an extra day? I mean, most people would say no. And this week, the Supreme Court agreed. The court ruled that the states can continue counting mail ballots that are postmarked by Election Day but arrive during a legally authorized grace period. Okay, that was a setback for Donald Trump and the Republican National Committee, who had challenged the Mississippi law. Now, on the surface, that sounds like one technical election case. All right? I don't think that's what it is. And here's why. Donald Trump spent years telling Americans that mail voting can't be trusted. He argued that ballots arriving after Election Day shouldn't count, even if the state law allowed it and the voter had done everything correctly. Now, the Supreme Court just rejected one of the central legal arguments behind that campaign. and that matters. But here's the part that I think deserves more attention because that wasn't an isolated fight. It's a chapter in a much larger story, okay? Over the last several years, we've watched battles over mail ballots, redistricting, certification, voter ID requirements, election administration, and recently, the SAVE Act, okay? Those aren't identical issues, but they all revolve around the same question. Who gets to shape the rules of American elections? Now, most states say the Secretary of State, but that's why I keep coming back to our episode 37 of The Quiet Loud. I said something that I still believe today, that the allegations Trump makes collapse, but the restrictions stay. The courts rejected dozens of fraud claims after the 2020 election, and that didn't end the political fight. It just shifted the focus. Instead of proving widespread fraud in court, the conversation increasingly became about changing election laws, tightening voting procedures, and reshaping the way elections are administered. Reasonable people can debate policies, okay? That's democracy. That's what we're supposed to do. But I think it's important to recognize that we're no longer talking about one lawsuit or one election. We're talking about competing visions of how elections should work. And here's something that often gets lost. Behind every one of those cases are ordinary people, elections workers, county officials, volunteers. Okay, the people setting up voting machines before sunrise and counting ballots long after election day. All right, since 2020, many of those workers have faced harassment and threats simply for doing their jobs. Think Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss out of Georgia. Okay, that's not healthy for democracy. Whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, none of the above, Libertarian, whatever, we should all want qualified people willing to administer elections without fearing for their safety. Now, does the Supreme Court ruling settle this debate? Not really, not even close. Congress is still debating election legislation. States are still writing election laws. Campaigns are still preparing for the next fight. But this decision does answer one important question. If a voter follows the law and casts a ballot on time under their own state's rules, the court says that vote can still count. All right? That's a meaningful ruling. Donald Trump lost this case. I don't think he lost a larger political argument yet that he's trying to have with the country because that debate is still unfolding. But we have to stick to this. We have to be informed because that's when people fall for the propaganda. That's exactly why this story matters, because election rules don't just affect candidates. Eventually, they affect every voter. And speaking of things that eventually affect all of us, let's talk about your grocery bill. You know what I noticed over the last couple of weeks? Every time somebody talked about Iran, they talked about missiles or diplomacy or whether Donald Trump got a ceasefire. But very few people talked about your grocery bill. And that's the part that interests me, because foreign policy eventually becomes personal. When fighting threatened traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, energy markets reacted immediately. Insurance costs rose, shipping companies became more cautious, traders started pricing in uncertainty. The good news is that some of the immediate panic has ceased. Okay, we all go to the gas station. That's a good thing. Oil prices have come down from their highest levels after shipping resumed and fears of prolonged disruption has cooled. That's real. It's also not the whole story. Supply chains have not yet recovered, and they don't recover nearly as fast as the headlines do. A shipping company can't simply flip a switch because politicians announce that they have a deal. Insurance companies still evaluate risk, and businesses are still paying higher transportation costs. All right, that process takes time. And that's why I keep saying the economy isn't just about what happened today. It's about what happened 3 weeks ago and how long those effects will stay with us. This is also where I think politicians of both parties sometimes get ahead of themselves. Everybody wants to declare victory. Markets don't work that way. Consumers don't either. If prices come down, then people will notice. If they don't, people will notice that too. They can't get caught up in the statements of Donald Trump saying that things are going to be, well, we're going to, play some increased energy prices, but it's all going to come down. We know that that's not happening like that. We don't see it. We know the deals aren't happening. We know that the prices are rising and falling in the market based on Donald Trump coming out and making these daily statements that he knows are not true. Okay? That's why I don't measure foreign policy by the press conference. I measure it by whether life actually becomes more affordable, which Donald Trump just told you affordability was a big yawn. Housing is a big yawn. He doesn't care about those things. He already said it. He said it himself, sitting behind the Resolute desk. So can families fill up the gas tank without thinking twice? Can businesses manage their shipping costs? Can parents buy groceries without feeling like every trip costs a little bit more than the last one? These are the questions that matter to me and to the American people. Okay? Because that's where policy becomes everyday life for us. We're dealing with this every day. We're seeing it on our receipts. Okay? We're seeing it on the display at the gas station. And if you've ever watched this show for even a while, you've probably heard me say something similar to that before. People don't vote based on GDP charts. They vote based on how life feels. If your paycheck isn't stretching this far, if groceries keep getting more expensive, if you feel like you're working harder just to stay in the same place, that's the economy people remember. Okay? Not the one on TV, the one in their checking account. Which brings me to the last story tonight, because when government asks you for your trust, it also has to earn it. Okay? And this last report might surprise you, because I don't actually think this story is totally about just Jeffrey Epstein anymore. I think it's about transparency and secrecy. Congress passed a law requiring the Justice Department to release the Epstein files with limited exceptions. The department said it reviewed and released millions of pages, but a federal judge is still asking questions about what remains withheld and why, because we know that there's somewhere about 2.5 million, based on their own assessment of about 6 million total files, 2.5 million that we have not yet received. And that's where the story is, okay? Not in all the rumors or the theories or the anonymous lists floating around social media. Hey, we want to know who's on there, but we need to find out the real way, through government transparency, through the Department of Justice releasing these materials. Instead, they're explaining that some materials remain protected by legal privilege and privacy concerns and other legal requirements. Some of those explanations may be completely legitimate. Victims do deserve privacy. But which victims are they talking about? I've talked about this before too. Some of the actual victims of assault have had their names doxed, their information put out there. Meanwhile, the names of the people who were possibly perpetrators, friends of Epstein and Trump and whoever the other people who were over on Epstein Island, they have had their names redacted. So it begs the question, who are they talking about when they say victims? I believe that victims deserve privacy. Attorney-client privilege exists for a reason. Not every redaction is evidence of wrongdoing, but transparency laws exist for a reason too. And when Congress orders disclosure, the public deserves a clear explanation of what has been released, of what hasn't been released, and why it hasn't been released. That's especially true in a case that has damaged public confidence for years. Okay? We know that this thing is rising to the highest level. So here's what caught my attention. The judge didn't simply accept the government's assurances. He asked the department to show its work. And I think that's healthy. Government shouldn't expect people to trust it simply because it says, well, we complied, we released everything, even though we know that you haven't. It should be willing to demonstrate that it complied. And those are two different things. Put up or shut up. And I think that that's the lesson that extends far beyond this case. Public trust isn't built through these statements. It's built through transparency. Okay? That's true whether we're talking about the Justice Department, whether we're talking about Congress, or any administration. People are much more willing to accept difficult answers if they believe they're getting the whole truth. And we haven't had the whole truth from anybody in this administration, this term or the first. Okay? That's why this story matters. Not because of the salacious names involved or the other things that happen, but because accountability only works if the public can see enough to judge whether accountability has actually happened or not. When I started reading this week's news, I honestly thought I was looking at 4 separate stories. But like I said, by the end of the week, I didn't believe that anymore. The Supreme Court redefined presidential power. It weighed in on election rules. Global markets reminded us how quickly instability reaches American families, and a federal judge reminded the Justice Department that transparency isn't just something government promises. It's something government has to demonstrate. Those aren't random headlines. They're all asking versions of the same question. Who gets power and who gets to keep it? And that's why I do this show. Not just to chase the headlines, to connect them. Because once you start seeing that pattern, it's hard to unsee it. If you found tonight's report helpful, I'd appreciate if you subscribe, share it with someone who enjoys thoughtful conversations, and let me know what story you think everyone else is missing. And then I'll do my best to bring it to the Quiet Loud, okay? And as I always ask you, I want you to stay grounded, stay informed, and stay loud quietly. This is Quiet Loud. Y'all take care.